In the tropical regions of the New World, there is a most unusual variety of ant. More conventional ant species tend to live off of a combination of arthropod prey and whatever sugary substances they might happen across. These ants consume an altogether different sort of diet. One can sometimes see the foraging workers of these ants carrying fragments of harvested vegetation back to their nests. One might easily suppose that they feed on this plant material. Indeed, each colony does function as the equivalent of a large herbivore, on par with something like a deer or a bison. However, the truth is a little more complicated. A closer inspection reveals a deep symbiosis with a fungus, which actually consumes the procured pieces of plants. The ants cultivate the fungus in subterranean gardens and live off of it as their primary food source. Still, the fungus must be fed a steady supply of suitable materials, so the ants regularly venture out of their nests in search of fresh greens. They have a few adaptations for procuring such fare. Their mandibles are quite sharp, allowing them to cut away fragments of leaves and stems. Their legs are relatively long, making them fairly agile and capable climbers. They even have a few defensive spines on their backs to discourage potential predators while they work out in the open. As they are frequently seen cutting and carrying bits of leaves, they are most commonly known as leafcutter ants. Proper leafcutter ants are found in two genera, Atta and Acromyrmex. The latter genus name roughly translates into spiny ant, while the former genus name Atta might be derived from Atticus, the Greek word for a variety of locust. Regardless of the details of their nomenclature, these two genera contain ants that have developed a symbiosis that allows them to indirectly consume living vegetation. This is all but unheard of among the ants, and it has proven to be a remarkably successful strategy. A mature leafcutter ant colony typically contains over 1 million workers, sometimes well over 2 million. The collective biomass is equivalent to that of a large herbivore, and the colony has a comparable appetite. By some estimates, roughly a quarter of the vegetation consumption in the neotropics is carried out by these specialized ants. This makes them a significant ecological force. Yet, among the leafcutters, every successful colony has a relatively humble beginning. Most ant colonies begin with a founding queen, and these particular ants are no exception. However, the queen in this case has a couple of rather exceptional qualities. To begin with, she is a giant among her kind. The largest workers among the leafcutters might reach a little over 1 centimeter in length. The queen is roughly 2 centimeters long. She also has a much larger thorax than the workers to accommodate a set of powerful flight muscles. Though she has wings when she leaves her nest, they do not last for very long. Just long enough for her to mate and seek out a suitable place to start a new colony. She sheds her wings and digs a roughly vertical burrow just wide enough to accommodate her. At the bottom of this burrow, at least a good 20 centimeters underground, she excavates a single chamber. At this point, her other exceptional quality emerges, or rather is spat out. Before leaving the nest she hatched in, she collected a small clump of fungus from the gardens. She carried that bit of fungus in her mouth while she was flying about, receiving the attentions of one or more male ants, and excavating her new home. With these tasks complete, she spits out the scrap of living fungus and begins a new garden. While she is tending to this garden, she also lays a number of eggs. Due to a quirk of ant biology, she can store the genetic material of her mating partners for several years. Within her ample abdomen, she has stockpiled enough sperm to fertilize millions of eggs, even after her paramours are long since deceased. Some of the eggs she lays are fertilized and hatch into larvae, which she attentively cares for. She feeds them on some of the other eggs she lays, which are not fertilized and are more or less used as omelets for her offspring. These so-called trophic eggs are a common food source in the colonies of certain ant species. Eventually, she moves the larvae onto the expanding fungus garden. They begin to feed on special outgrowths of the fungus known as gongolidia. Functionally, these rounded structures are bags of vital nutrients, perfectly balanced for the larval diet. Still, the fungus also requires regular feeding. The queen cannot afford to go outside in search of suitable bits of vegetation, so instead she feeds the growing fungal mat with regular droplets of fluid excreted from her posterior. Until the larvae mature into workers, she must supply both the fungus and her developing offspring with nutrients from her own body. These nutrients are taken from a combination of her fat reserves and the degradation of her flight muscles. This is why leafcutter ants are so massive. Each must see to the nutritional needs of the entire colony in the beginning. They need to be large enough to sustain things until the first brood of workers reaches adulthood. This takes at least a month, and sometimes up to 2 months. As soon as there are a few worker ants, the queen radically changes her duties. Instead of a general caregiver to both fungus and larvae, she becomes pretty well exclusively devoted to egg laying. Meanwhile, the workers climb up out of the nest, often clearing the passage that has most likely become at least partially blocked during the past several weeks. If all goes well, they return with a few bits of vegetation and take over the fungal gardening duties. As the colony grows and the fungal mycelium expands, the subsequent generations of workers are soon diversified into castes. Though each larva goes through the same number of molts, differences in care result in them growing to different sizes. Once they have metamorphosed into adult workers, there is no further growth or significant alteration. Very roughly speaking, there are 4 functional castes in a colony of Atta or Acromyrmex. These castes vary in size and in the relative size of their heads. Proportionally, the larger workers have larger heads in relation to the rest of their bodies. This difference in body proportion is known as allometry, which essentially means different measure. The largest worker caste is the majors. These can exceed a centimeter in length, approaching about half an inch. Their heads are expanded heart-shaped structures, generally at least a couple of millimeters wide. In ants and other insects, a large head is not really indicative of a large brain. Rather, it is usually a sign of strong jaw muscles. These majors are specialized for colony defense, and they can deliver quite painful bites. The next caste are sometimes known as the Myuu. These are of intermediate size. Their heads and jaw muscles are still well developed, but not quite to the absurd degree of the majors. Ants in this caste work as foragers, going out to collect vegetation for the colony. Within the nest, most of the basic maintenance tasks are handled by a smaller caste known as the miners. This caste also helps to process the leaf fragments the Myuu bring into the nest. The fragments are cut into smaller pieces, chewed to some degree, and eventually inserted into the fungal gardens. Inside these gardens, the smallest caste of ants collectively tend to the fungus. These are the minims, typically no more than a couple of millimeters long, with heads a little more than half a millimeter across. A minim could easily perch on top of the head of a major, likely with room to spare. This small size is necessary for weeding out unwanted microbes among the fungal growth. However, these little ants would be much too small to cut or collect any pieces of vegetation outside of the nest. Meanwhile, the larger castes aren't able to really give proper attention to the fungal gardens. The drastic differences in size are essential for the proper functioning of a leafcutter ant colony. Now, these ants do not just grow any fungus they happen to find. They only cultivate a specific type, a species known as Leucoagaricus gongulophorus. The name roughly translates into white mushrooms that carry round things. Somewhat amusingly, this species is in the same family as Agaricus bisporus, sometimes known as the button mushroom, commonly cultivated for human consumption. As for Leucoagaricus, it is a species found only in the nests of leafcutter ants. Its most distinctive feature is the gongolidia, which are the basis of the species name Gongolophorus. These are rounded elliptical swellings that extend from the underlying hyphae. For all intents and purposes, each gongolidium is a little bag of nutrients for workers and larvae to consume. As adult ants can only really consume fluids, the workers consume the liquid center of each gongolidium. In contrast, the larvae consume the entire structure. It is worth mentioning that the workers also consume sap from the leaves they cut, mainly as a source of sugars. This sap can easily be shared with the smaller workers that usually remain within the nest. The queen subsists on a diet of fungus, shared sap, and the occasional trophic egg from the workers. Returning to the fungal gardens, it is worth noting that every garden seems to have at least a few weeds. There are various sorts of microbes that must be regularly removed by the ants for the health of the garden. Escovopsis is a genus of fungus that acts as a sort of microfungus parasitizing other fungi. It is sometimes referred to as a variety of black yeast. Interestingly enough, the ants tending the garden do not rely only upon their antimicrobial metapleural glands or the mechanical removal of undesirable invaders. They also appear to maintain populations of bacteria in the genus Pseudonocardia. This particular sort of bacterium produces toxins that eliminate the invasive fungus. Another fundamental aspect of gardening is regular cleanup. New material is constantly brought in for the fungus to consume. At the same time, every scrap of vegetation is steadily losing its nutrient content as the fungus feeds on it. Eventually, the expended fragments are taken away from the fungal gardens and disposed of in large dumping chambers that sometimes extend several meters underground. Air circulation is another issue with underground gardening, and the different species of leafcutter ants have various sorts of mounds above their subterranean tunnels. Generally speaking, warmer air, heated by the fungal metabolism, exits from the higher openings in the middle of the nest mound. Cooler air tends to enter through lower openings around the edges of the mound. The height difference of these openings may also aid with circulation, as air tends to move a bit faster on raised points of ground. This faster wind speed creates a region of slightly lower pressure, which draws the air out of the top of the mound. By extension, this draws air in at the lower entrances with slower air speeds. A mature colony of leafcutter ants exists on a scale seldom seen in the insect world. Most ant colonies might require a shovel to excavate. One of these colonies tends to require a bulldozer. Given the size of the nest, the ant population of millions, and the extensive fungal gardens required to feed them, it should come as no surprise that there are a number of guests that tend to invite themselves over. Generally speaking, species that make a habit of imposing upon the dubious hospitality of the ants are known as Myrmecophiles. Roughly translated, one could read this term as ant enthusiasts. Varieties of ant with large colonies often have quite a few varieties of Myrmecophiles, and the leafcutter ants are no exception. For example, there is a genus of cockroaches, Attaphylla, that live within some of the nests of the ants in the genus Atta. These specialized cockroaches are wingless and relatively small. They are adapted to blend in with the surrounding ants by mimicking the colony odor. Specialized crickets in the genus Myrmecophiles, commonly known as ant crickets, are also sometimes found among the leafcutter ants. The genus is part of the family Myrmecophilidae, which are more or less all adapted as social parasites of various ant colonies. Some species of so-called camel crickets in the genus Pseudophilus also make their homes in leafcutter ant nests. There is even a species of ant, Pseudoatta argentina, that lives as a parasite in Acromyrmex colonies. This parasitic ant species has no worker caste, just short-lived males and queens that essentially mooch off of the host workers. Some of the extra residents of leafcutter nests are far less troublesome. There are a number of hister beetles and staphylinid beetles that occupy the chambers where the ants dispose of their leftovers. Hardly an imposition lurking in what amounts to the garbage dump rather than the brood chamber. That being said, some of the more carnivorous beetles might be something of a problem. Maybe every now and then a worker goes to drop off a bit of detritus and never returns. Another resident of these middens is the fly species Myrmecophiles. This fly is parasitized by a lethal parasitoid wasp, Coptera foliomyia. Such parasitism is not uncommon in the insect world. Even the ants themselves have their share of parasitoids. They are sometimes preyed upon by tiny species of phorid flies that dive-bomb the ants to lay their eggs on the thoraxes. The larvae develop within the ants, eventually entering their heads. The ant head is slowly hollowed out as the maggot feeds, and usually falls off after a while. This severed head is then used as an armored case for the parasitic maggot to pupate inside of. A similar pattern is seen in the somewhat famous decapitating phorid flies. These particular parasitoids have been imported into the United States for use as a form of biological control against invasive fire ants. The attacks of such airborne parasites are especially troublesome for leafcutter workers that are carrying vegetation back to the nest. After all, the mandibles of an ant are roughly equivalent to hands for a human, and thus an ant carrying a leaf fragment in its jaws is an ant that has its hands full. It is also encumbered by the extra weight, so it can't flee all that effectively either, at least not without dropping its prize, which would negate the entire point of leaving the nest in the first place. Sometimes one can find smaller workers leaving the nest and actually riding on the leaf fragments the foraging workers carry back. There is some evidence to suggest, at least in some cases, that these little ants are riding along as a sort of security force for their larger sisters. Something vaguely akin to a fighter escort for a cargo plane. Regardless of the details, the leafcutter ants may easily be regarded as paragons of cooperation. They work with the fungus to gain access to an otherwise inedible food source. They also work with one another, with a wide range of castes handling the various tasks. Such sophisticated cooperation has made this group among the most successful of the ants, and insects in general. Thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this brief glimpse into the more unusual side of the natural world. If you wish to know more, here are a few things that might be worth looking into. If you found this enjoyable, feel free to leave a like. If you think others would enjoy this content, by all means, share. If you have something to say or ask about, honest comments are always welcome. If you wish to see more from this channel, a subscription would be most helpful. Until next time.